Welcome to this week's Short Clip Friday podcast. On Fridays, I will be posting clips from previous episodes, and the point here is just to bring you some of the highest yield topics from each podcast in order to kind of reinforce those topics. This clip is from the Muscular System podcast and covers the different types of muscle fibers. Enjoy. In terms of the MCAT, really there's only going to be type 1, which are slow twitch fibers, and type 2, which are fast twitch fibers. And so as I said earlier, muscles are made up of individual bundles of fibers called fascicles, and each of these individual muscle fibers or muscle cells can have a different phenotype, that being either slow twitch or fast twitch. And there are a few main differences between these fiber types. I'm going to talk about 3 differences. The first I'm going to talk about is their different modes of metabolism. Then I'll talk about their rate of contraction and their rate of fatigue. And then I'll talk about how much myoglobin each of these fiber types has. There's differences beyond that, but those are the 3 I'm going to cover. All right, so let's start out with difference number 1. And to me, this is the most interesting difference. So in general, type 1 or slow twitch fibers rely mostly on oxidative phosphorylation for energy. And remember, this oxidative phosphorylation pathway is the pathway that uses the mitochondria and ends up producing about 32 ATP in the end. And this is also known as the aerobic pathway because it requires oxygen. On the other hand, type 2 fibers, which are the fast twitch fibers, rely on the glycolysis pathway, which is also called the anaerobic pathway because it does not require oxygen. And that's kind of interesting, right? Because this glycolysis pathway is one that doesn't produce a lot of energy. If you remember from the metabolism podcast or just in general, you'll remember that in glycolysis, you only generate 2 ATP and you produce 2 NADH and 2 pyruvate. But comparing that to oxidative phosphorylation, you're not producing much energy, which to me is a bit counterintuitive, right? Because these fast twitch muscle fibers, as you'll hear in a sec, are able to contract faster. These are what you're going to be using when you're sprinting or doing squats or lifting weights. And so what you'd think is that you need more ATP to do these high intensity activities, but really it comes down to the fact that glycolysis is a lot quicker than oxidative phosphorylation, right? You can produce ATP at a much faster rate, which then lets these muscle fibers contract at a faster rate, which is why they're called fast twitch muscle fibers. For the same reason, these fast twitch muscle fibers tend to be a bit bigger in diameter because they need glycogen, right? Glycogen is just the stored form of glucose, and you can break that down and go through glycolysis pretty quickly to generate those ATP, but you need a big storage of glycogen because you're going to run through a lot of glucose in this process. And another thing that's related to this metabolism difference between these 2 fiber types is the fact that these 2 different fiber types have different mitochondrial phenotypes. So it's been shown that mitochondria in the slow twitch fibers tend to be more elongated and kind of interconnected, meaning that, I will have 2 mitochondria and they tend to elongate and kind of connect with each other to form these big mitochondria. On the other hand, in the fast twitch fibers, you tend to have less mitochondria in general, and the mitochondria tend to be smaller and more fragmented. And the theory here is that since the fast twitch fibers don't really need the mitochondria because they're just doing glycolysis, that the mitochondria respond by fragmenting and becoming smaller, whereas in the slow twitch fiber, they respond by fusing together and getting bigger and elongating because those muscle cells are using oxidative phosphorylation a lot. And you might be saying, yeah, obviously these mitochondria are going to change and there's nothing cool about this. But I just think it's interesting. My view was always that mitochondria are kind of these static organelles that are just there to produce energy and that's kind of all they do. But it is interesting to kind of know that they can change their phenotype based upon the energy needs of the cell. All right, so all of that was to say that in general, type 1 or slow twitch fibers rely mostly on oxidative phosphorylation for energy, whereas type 2 or fast twitch fibers rely mostly on glycolysis, which is also known as the anaerobic pathway. The next difference, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, was that in general, fast twitch fibers have a faster contractile rate, but they fatigue faster. That's something that I didn't mention. And they fatigue faster because you're only producing 2 ATP per round of glycolysis, which is what these muscle fiber types are relying on. So in other words, in the fast twitch fiber, you're going to be creating all this ATP very rapidly through glycolysis, which is going to mean you can contract that muscle very fast, but because you're using this glycolysis pathway, you're going to run through all of your stored glycogen and your muscle is going to fatigue quickly. On the other hand, slow twitch muscle fibers tend to be slower in contracting, but also slower to fatigue. These are the muscle fiber types that you would use if you're, say, jogging or walking or doing some kind of low impact activity. And again, this goes back to metabolism, right? These slow twitch fibers like to use the oxidative phosphorylation pathway, and therefore they're a little slower in producing ATP, but they can produce a lot more. So yes, they may be slower to contract, but because you have this plethora of ATP32 being made, then this muscle is going to be a little bit slower to fatigue. The last difference I want to talk about here is in myoglobin. So fast twitch muscles tend to have less myoglobin. Slow twitch muscles tend to have more myoglobin. And myoglobin is just a protein that's able to kind of hold on to oxygen. And so that makes sense that slow twitch fibers would have more myoglobin. And what this myoglobin does is it actually makes the muscle look a little bit more red. So if you were to look at a cross-section of muscle, like on a slide under a microscope, you'd see that these slow twitch fibers appear to be more red than the fast twitch fibers would be a little more white in appearance. So if for whatever reason you were given like an image on the MCAT of like a microscope slide and asked which fiber type, just remember that slow twitch fibers are more red, fast twitch fibers are lighter, typically more of like a white color, or pink at least. And so one last thing I want to mention before the next segment of the podcast is where these fibers are found in the muscle. So what you typically see is that these fiber types are intermingled in the muscle, meaning that if I sliced a muscle lengthwise and looked at the cross-section, these different fiber types would be kind of interwoven. I wouldn't just have, a clump of fast twitch and a clump of slow twitch. They're kind of weaved in with each other. And depending upon the muscle group I look at, there are varying proportions of these fiber types. So for example, the human soleus leg muscle is predominantly made up of type 1 fibers, which again are slow twitch fibers, whereas the tricep or triceps arm muscle is predominantly type 2 muscle fibers, which are fast twitch. And in contrast to the tricep, the bicep is more of like a 50-50 mix of fast twitch and slow twitch.
Med School Coach, we know that getting into medical school is hard. In fact, 60% of pre-meds who apply to medical school don't even get accepted. And if you want to get accepted into a top medical school, it's even harder. It's a complicated process, and even students with great grades and MCAT scores get left out. That's why more students than ever are turning to Med School Coach for admissions advising. Our advisors are all physicians and former admissions committee members, so they know exactly what medical schools are looking for. One-on-one admissions advising from Med School Coach makes all the difference. Our expert team will help you develop a game plan, prepare your application, edit your essays, and coach you for interviews. Every pre-med has a story, and we'll help you tell it so you can stand out from the crowd. Visit us online at medschoolcoach.com and use offer code PODCAST10 to save 10% up to $400 on a Med School Coach admissions advising package. You can achieve your medical school dreams, and Med School Coach can help.